Hi everyone, how are you? This lecture will talk a little bit about timing. We'll continue on from where we left off last semester, but I first just wanted to mention what we'll be doing this week in class. What you'll need to do is you'll need to find a piece of animation which has two characters. They can be fighting each other or they can be dancing with each other. They just have to be interacting with each other. And the trick with this assignment is that one of the characters has to start in a base pose and he should also finish in the same base pose. So if you see here, we've got two characters. One picks him up and throws him and he goes back into his base pose. So the start and finish should be the same. The other character, it doesn't really matter. And you can grab any reference you like. I've got a bunch of reference clips, so if you want to just select one of those, you're more than welcome. But if there's a video game or some sort of move that you really would like to do, bring that in for class this week, and we can animate to that. So in this case here, we've got this character here. He's in his base pose, and then he will finish in the same base pose. There's the start and there's the end. Okay, so he does his action, grabs the character, throws him, but then goes back into the base pose. Okay, here's another one. Now this is interesting. So base poses for side-scrolling games, you should always have your character facing towards the viewer. So you'll see here with Ryu, he's got this front arm down, okay, but if he faces the other direction, they've mirrored the pose. Okay, you would expect that, you know, if he was to turn, this is his left arm here. Well, you would expect if he was to be facing the other direction, we would see his back and his left arm would be down. But what you tend to do is to make it interesting for the player. You don't want to ever look at someone's back, so you always what we call open the character towards the camera. But if you wanted to do that, you're more than welcome to. You know, he's not going back into exactly the same base pose, but if you wanted to design the base pose so that it is appealing facing the audience, then by all means do that. So I'll just go back to this. This is someone's demo reel of all of their animation that they've designed for certain video games. And if you have a look, you know, all of these pieces, they start in a base pose and then they go back into the same base pose. I'll just see if I can find one. Oh, there we go. Let's have a look at this guy here. So he starts off and he'll finish in that same base pose. Same with that guy. Same with that guy. Same with this guy. Goes back into his base pose. And so that's what we want to do. We want to be able to design a really cool base pose and do our animation and then have it go back into it. So let's see if there's anything else here which is kind of cool. I would recommend that you do a little bit of research into people's demo reels for when they were playing for video games and just see what other people are doing out there, because there's some really interesting stuff. You can see here that, you know, it's not necessary for it to be beautifully rendered and lit. You know, we can still see that this is just a render in Maya, just a simple play blast. You know, the guy hasn't even put lights in the scene, but at least what this guy is getting hired for is he wants an animation position. So in most cases, you don't really need to worry too much about what the look of your animation is like. Sorry, your animation has to look great, but you know, having lights and fancy rendering, often that's not important. Okay, so we'll talk about timing. Remember what we were discussing last time, which was that, you know, you've got to think of when you're animating, you've got to think of it in terms of music. And you want to have a lot of mixture or contrast between your motion. Okay, you don't want everything to be happening at a similar beat. So one thing happens, then another thing happens, then another thing happens, then another thing happens, and you don't want it to all feel like it is the same scale. Meaning, it's only dialed up to around about 5 or 6. Every motion is just, it feels like it has a very similar tempo and speed. You want there to be contrast. So whenever you're designing your piece, you want there to be, quick pieces, but they could be quick but very small and in scale. So they're not moving too much, but they're just quick little nervous pieces of textural animation. Or you could have very quick pieces and very broad gestures. Like this. We'll see what, like this. See if we can find a broad piece of animation here. Something like this, for example. Very quick and huge. And then also what you want to try to incorporate is areas where there is slower pieces of animation, and in some cases, time when there is nothing that's happening. Okay, so that you're giving the audience a rest. And in this case here, you can see that nothing is happening. He puts his hand out, goes into this very broad, quick gesture, does that quite quickly, but then he just stops, and we just pause on that for a little bit. You can imagine that with this Tom and Jerry piece, because it's so frenetic and there's so much going on, if you were just to have constant motion happening all the time, the audience would become quite exhausted, would become quite tired looking at that. So you want to mix it up wherever possible. Okay. So always try to have 3 different speeds in your shot. And this is an example that Victor Navone has on his website here. And if you were to analyze this piece, you can see here what we're talking about. So we start off with these nice slow head move with a pause, just very, very slow. Then we start to build up the speed, very broad and a lot of texture there. We pause at this part here, okay, so that we get a read on the character's face, so that we can see what the dog is thinking, what the dog is feeling, okay. And then this is nice because if you have a look at it, it has this really high frequency bounce in there. So it's very quick, but they're also very small, okay. And then I'll just play that bit. So it goes into this nice textural piece. And then the timing in this is beautiful. So it has this nice long slow out into this pose here, and then a nice slow into this pose, and then it accelerates quickly into this slumping into a heap. And so this is beautiful. I mean, it just has so many speeds and different ideas, and it creates this piece which is of great interest. Okay, so there's nothing really boring about this at all. And it's almost like you could think of this as a piece of music as well. It feels like it has rhythm. Everything, there's this nice timing to it. There's these nice beats with this piece. Even though it has a lot of stuff going on, I think if you were to put this to music, it would probably play out beautifully. Okay, so it's not chaotic by any means. It actually does have a sense of rhythm, which is really important when you're thinking of your animation. And that goes back to that Tom and Jerry piece that I was showing you. I wanted to show that with the music, because animation is music with motion. Now, this was a piece that I did. I've got 3 characters. Now, often if you've got characters, 3 different characters in your scene, you want to break up the timing, meaning that all of the characters shouldn't be moving at the same time, but they also shouldn't be moving at the same speed either. So in this case, we've got alpha, gamma, and beta. And alpha here is he's supposed to be the smart dog. Then we've got the heavy, beta, and then we've got gamma over here. And gamma's not too clever. He's a little bit slow. And that is something which is interesting for the animator to know, because if we want our character here to seem a little bit more stupid than the other 2 characters, then what we can do is we can get his timing to lag behind what these other 2 characters are doing. So like if these 2 characters are walking off, he's not too cluey, so we just hold his timing back. He doesn't do the same thing as these other characters the same time that they would. So what I've done is I've offset the time in which he moves, because it's like, oh, where are you guys going? Okay. Right. And these guys turn and move away from Doug. Doug's over here. And poor old Gamma, who's not in on the joke, is like, oh, all right, I'm going to head off now. But what that also allowed me to do is that you can see here that the speed in which these 2 characters are moving, it's a little bit slow and with purpose, but that gave me the opportunity to have Gamma's speed a little bit quicker. So there's high frequency in there, if you have a look. Okay, so he gets to move a little bit quicker. And that worked out brilliantly, because these guys were just about off screen, and that left him behind, but he wants to play catch up. So I get to move him quicker. So by doing that, rather than having all 3 characters moving off frame at the same time, which is pretty boring, I got the chance to mix it up a little bit. So we'll just have a look at that.
Yes, definitely.
And off he goes. Now, with video games, and with these fight sequences that you guys will be doing, one of the important things, and you'll notice this with a lot of martial arts movies, where they hold these poses. And the reason that they do this is that it just adds interest. When you're in a fight, you don't tend to just hold a pose. You don't tend to, you see a lot of Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris films, and when they're fighting, they hold this pose, and then they go into the next move, and then they hold the pose again after they've done an attack, right? Well, the reason that they're doing this is to really just show the audience, this is what I've done, okay, to allow them the time to take in what has just happened, all right? But there's this beautiful sort of dance to it. So you can see here where we hold the pose, and then it has the transition into the next pose. It has like these slow ins and slow outs almost, as well as these snaps. So depending on what is happening, you can see here that there's a variation in speed, which is kind of cool. So you might go from one pose, let's see this. So we've got this nice slow, and then it gets really quick through there, and then it starts to slow out into this pose, and then he snaps down, and then a quick action, and then he goes into the hold, and then a slow out, and then, accelerates, and then, another hold, another moment of pause. So you get this really nice dance happening, okay? All this variation in speed and scale. That's what we want to introduce. And this sort of stuff is actually quite hard to design. It seems simple, but the animator would have spent a lot of time and really explored the options. When should I accelerate into a move, or when should I have the hold? Well, when you should have the hold is probably, that's the easiest part, because that's when you design really nice, interesting poses. But the dance or the transitions between each of those poses, that's something that you'd want to play around with. Where would you have the slow ins and slow outs? Where would you have those snappy, zippy moments? And that's completely up to you. That's your choice. And that's the beauty of animation. You get to decide all that cool stuff. And so with video games, we do something similar. So where there is something of interest that's happening, like this one here, you can see that when she comes and does this big body slap, it holds here and then it holds here for just a little bit, so that we can see the coolness, the cool factor of what's actually just happened. Okay, so I'll just play this for you at speed so you can have a look at it. And that variation of slow with really quick is what makes the game look exciting. If you were just to have a character just bashing the crap out of each other just constantly without these moments of pause where you could actually see the moment of impact, it's going to be a little bit less interesting. Cool. So timing in animation, it is like musical motion, which I've been talking about, but it happens when we move, and it also happens when we talk and when we think. If you've ever watched William Shatner in the early days when he was on Star Trek, he was an interesting character back then because he understood the importance of timing for when we talk. And he tried something a little different with his talking. Most of us actually do talk with some sort of rhythm or some sort of with a sense of beats. The amount of time that we have a hold in between when we're saying our sentences, it really depends on the tempo of how we're talking at the time. So with politicians, you'll see that they will stop and they will talk like this. It has a sense of time and beats. Well, let's have a look at Bill.
Last night, pre-flight, 0 hour, 9 a.m. And I'm gonna be high.
And so you notice there that, even though this is for a song, this is how William Shatner used to talk on some of the TV shows. So there's a lot of there's texture, but there's also variation in
0 hour.
So this is like 0 hour,
9 a.m.
9 a.m. And there's this nice pause here.
And I'm going to be
pause.
High.
Oops, sorry. I can't pause it, but anyway, you get the idea. And one of the tricks with it is that obviously we want some sort of variation. We need there to be contrast, but we don't want it to be even and predictable. Okay, so in this case here, you can see that we've got at the very top, we've got this sense of it's all even and it's spaced evenly, and that becomes predictable. The variation, there's no variation in scale. There's no contrast. It's just that this thing is happening, next 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 thing is happening, and there's no scale. It's the same size, and it's incredibly boring. It's interesting for the first 1 or 2 seconds because we're anticipating there to be some sort of beat or some sort of change later on. But if it doesn't happen, we get incredibly bored. And also, random and unpredictable is it can be interesting at first, but if it becomes too random and too chaotic, and there isn't a sense of rhythm or beat, then we will switch off as well. So you've got to be careful. The way that you design something, it takes a lot of planning. So the best way to kind of illustrate this is if we look at it in dance, okay? Okay, so first off, this just feels like yesterday for me, but it's 2001, and there was this competition in America, and this was just when pop locking was just breaking into the scene, right? And it's a competition that they held every year, and this sort of dance was just coming into its own. Of course, we had breakdance and everything else before that, but this was this little guy. He comes out on stage, and if you notice, everything is very much the same. It's interesting to start off with. I mean, technically, he's very, very good. But the problem with it is that he doesn't mix it up enough. So everything happens on the beat, changes, 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 but there's no variation in scale at all. And to the point where people that are over here get upset with him, and they ruin his dance for him. They just get bored with what he's doing, and they just basically kick him off stage. So the poor little guy. I mean, look, his stuff was great, but the others thought, you know what, you're just pretty much doing the same old thing over and over and over again, so we'll get rid of you. But it was interesting when this guy came out on stage, and you have this variation in scale. So he comes out and he's really high frequency. The timing in his motion is of interest because it contrasts what this guy here is doing. You know, it was very slow and pretty much the same. Whereas, you know, the contrast when this little guy comes out. It became of interest, you know, because the two are opposite to each other, high frequency and slow and methodical. So anyway, then what happens is then this other guy comes out right after this little guy. And I just want you to pay attention to how he mixes it up a little bit. At first, he starts off a certain way, but then he just lets loose. And every transition is different. It's different in scale, it's different in speed, you know, how big he makes himself, how small he makes himself, and also, you know, frenetic, high frequency noise, as well as nice, slow, broad pieces of movement. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about timing. It's not only just when things are happening on the beat, or if it's on the beat, but it's also the speed in which it happens on that beat, as well as how big that action is or how small that action is. So we're thinking in terms of frequency, and we're also thinking in terms of amplitude. So that is pretty much the best illustration I can find that reinforces this idea of what we're trying to do is we're trying to add contrast through speed and through size. And so you can see here that David Elsewhere, this is if you wanted to research this guy, his name's David Elsewhere, and he's done, you would have seen his stuff because he's been on a lot of commercials for Heineken and VW and that sort of thing over the years, but he was kind of discovered on this this stage right here, and this clip went viral back in the day and made him a very famous, wealthy person. But so he comes on and he's nice and tall and lanky, and he does this thing here, and it gets slower and slower and slower, and then he really starts to mix it up. And so what he's doing is we often talk about this in animation, which is shape changes, where characters are a certain, in his case, we've got, really tall and lanky, but then he makes himself nice and broad, wide, and then he starts to do these cool little S-shape things here, and then he makes himself incredibly small. So, he's going into this little ball, and so this variation in shape change is also what's appealing in animation. If you have your character and he's constantly the same shape throughout your animation, it's not nearly as interesting as when you start to mix up these shapes. Okay, and so here you can see, just how big he's trying to make himself, how tall and wide, and also the slow motion, this kind of robotic sort of slow feel that he does. And then what he does is he mixes it up to this nice fast quick action here, and then we have this high frequency little these high frequency little ticks, so it's almost like a strobe light going off here, very very small but very very quick. Nice fast action there, and then it goes into something which is a little bit slower. And compared to this poor guy, there's no real difference. He's the same scale, he's the same speed all the way through. The stuff is good, but he's really not mixing it up that much. Okay. And the same thing happens with acting. If you're a good actor, you have what's called range, which means that you can go from something which is quite small and subtle to something which is quite large. But you have to have like this depth to your personality, to your character. There has to be a contrast there. So you often have bad actors who just dial everything up to 9 or 10. They're just constantly yelling at the camera. And they think that that's acting, and they never really, have a quieter moment or something which is a little bit more, which shows more vulnerability or something like that. It's so that's something that you've got to think about with your dance, with your acting, with your singing. We have it when we're, for fantastic songs. It doesn't matter what genre it is. You have to have that contrast there. So you have to have the contrast in your animation for it to be appealing. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about anticipation, timing and anticipation. So slow and quick motion for anticipation, it really depends on who your character is. Understanding the personality of your character can sometimes depend on your choice or speed for anticipation. So in this case here,
I'd like a word with you if you don't mind.
Shere Khan. What a...
We've got this very confident character here, and the timing, the speed, that basically means the speed in which he moves or does his anticipation can be nice and slow because he has that confidence, and so you might see where he's where he opens up his claws, for example. He has a look at his hands, and then he slowly goes into this anticipation, and then the contrast is snap. Okay, so if we just watch that, for example, let's have a look.
Oh, no, nothing at all.
I thought perhaps you were entertaining someone up there.
It's kind of cool. As opposed to the this character's personality, the way that he's feeling at the moment. The anticipation, the timing of his anticipation might be a lot quicker because he's more nervous. Okay.
You're gonna pay.
So this little guy here, his anticipation so he goes from this pose here, and this is his anticipation here. Next coming up, there we go. It's quite quick, that anticipation. Going back before you go forward is quite quick. And then even this one here, this little anticipation, it's very quick, very fast before he comes over here. And once again, the anticipation going down before you move over this way, it's very quick. Here's a nice little piece of anticipation for this nice broad action here. But you can see that depending on the scale of your character or the size of your character, what they're feeling, then the timing for the way that they move or anticipate before an action, it varies. So, you're always looking to add contrast and timing, even when there's two characters. So two characters, say, walking. If you add texture, it will add, different timing in a walk will help add texture and interest. So, in this piece here, we've got two characters walking down the street. We've got Voight here, and we've got Dustin Hoffman. I forgot who it was there for a second, in Midnight Cowboy. And if you just have a look and see the variation in their walks, it helps add a little bit of contrast between these two.
They gotta have some kind of middleman. And that's where old Daniel comes in, you know what I mean? Hey! I'm walking here! I'm walking here! Up yours, you son of a bitch! You don't talk to me that way! Get out of here!
So for those of you who don't know the history of that shot, you can see here that this wasn't planned. That taxi had actually driven into this area that where they were filming this. This area here was supposed to be cordoned off. All of these people in the background here are paid actors. They're extras. And this taxi just about hits them. And you can see here that Voight is he's a little bit distressed by what's happened. And Voight was actually thinking that, okay, well, that's the shot, it's ruined. But Dustin Hoffman, he went on with it. So if you have a look, this is all ad-libbed. And that's why everyone in the background, you'll notice, all stop because they think something horrible has happened to their main actors. So it's almost like all these people back here are like, oh, what's happened? Not because this was completely unexpected.
Daniel comes in, you know what I mean? Hey! I'm walking here! I'm walking here! Up yours, you son of a bitch! You don't talk to me that way! Get out of here!
And then what Dustin Hoffman does, which is kind of cool, is he grabs Voight and says, come on, no, let's keep going. Keep going with this.
Don't worry about that. Actually, that ain't a bad way to pick up insurance, you know. That's great.
Brilliant. So one of the other things is, adding timing for thought process or subtext. Now this next piece here, this is from American Beauty, which is a fantastic film. And I got this little clip from Carlos Baina's website, so you can have a look at this on his site as well if you like. But just wanted to stop this. So I'll just have to go back. So anyway, there's this clip at the end. I don't want to ruin the movie for you guys. I highly recommend that you have a look at it because it's a brilliant film. Where he's being asked, "How are you?" And what you have to do whenever you're acting, you want to really give the impression that this is the first time that someone has asked you a question. Okay, a lot of actors make this mistake where they know what the line is. It's like, "How are you?" "Oh, I'm fine. I'm great. There, thanks." They already know what the line is that's coming to them, and so they've rehearsed it, and they don't allow for the spontaneity of really thinking something through. Okay, so when somebody says, "How are you?" and you're acting, you have to have the time to allow for that thought process to sink into your head and to play that out in your mind and really, act out like, "Oh, I'm thinking this through." Even though you've heard that line, 100 times before, you still have to, as a good actor, you have to play that out. And that's the difference between good acting and bad acting. And it's the thought process which gives us the subtext. Okay? And so here we'll just analyze this.
Good for her.
How are you?
That has been a long time since anybody asked me that. I'm great.
But it's brilliant. You can see there that Kevin Spacey, he's really what we would call opened up the scene. That means that he's taken the time to assimilate, to first of all, to listen to the question. He's surprised by the question. And then he assimilates it, starts to think about how he really is. How do I feel? And then he comes to the realization, yeah, I'm feeling pretty good. And then he delivers the line, "I'm great." But he gave enough time there for that to happen. And I think that as with animators, one of the tricks when acting is that we feel the need to rush the performance. It's like, we're getting paid by the second, and if you have a character who's just looking at the screen for some time and not doing anything, then we feel like we're not doing our job. But actually, sometimes you need there to be a moment of nothing, except to show the fact that you're thinking, that your character actually is processing information in their head. And that's an incredibly tricky thing to do, and it does take a bit of practice. So let's just have a look at this.
Good for her.
So he's surprised by the question.
How are you?
That has been a long time since anybody asked me that.
And then he realizes, and he assimilates,
I'm great.
and then he answers. Okay, so you have to break this down into those sections and then give time for each part of the acting performance: the realization, the surprise, the realization, the assimilation, and the answer. All of that needs its own time. Oops.
Good for her.
So this would be what it would look like if we didn't have the time.
How are you?
I'm great.
Not nearly as interesting. So if you've ever watched Pocoyo, it's a fantastic show. The thing which is really appealing about this show is just the simplistic nature of everything, of the design of the characters. There's no background. they only use props when needed, and they tell some interesting stories on this show. But the way in which the characters move is what's really interesting, and it just the variation in these speeds. You know, and allowing yourself the time for nothing to happen, which is pretty cool. It's like they're not going overboard with it, but then when they do move, they really have these interesting timing, going back to timing, interesting speeds and way of moving, which adds texture and makes the show very interesting to watch.
What's that? What? Oh, you think the umbrella moved? Are you sure?
So anyway, it's narrated by Stephen Fry. And if you haven't had a chance to look at some of these, I'd highly recommend it. But it's just a great study as to, you know, that nice, zippy, quirky style of cartoon animation. And I think that's the great thing about cartoon animation is that, you know, it offers you these tools to make your work that much more interesting. You want to try to break away from what you would normally see in everyday life as far as, you know, the way that we move. You want to exaggerate wherever possible and really play with these variations in speed. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that was of some help. Anyway, we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.